Hello and welcome to the fourth session of Doubting Climate Change, the role of public relations in creating doubt about the science behind climate change. In this session, we're going to be looking at various aspects of public relations and the components and elements that go to make up what the wider world of public relations is. So the structure of what we're going to be looking at in this short session today is looking at what is public relations, what is lobbying, what is advocacy, how do these different components that are lumped together under the umbrella of public relations, how do they work and how do they interact with each other, and what's their intended purpose? Because for each of these different elements there's a different purpose because of who's sponsoring the action, if you will. So to go back to the definition of what public relations is, I'll go back to Morris and Goldworthy's 2012 definition, which we talked about in session 1 and session 2. So public relations is the planned persuasion of people to behave in ways which further its sponsors' objectives. So the people who are paying for public relations are the sponsors, and what the activity that they're paying for is to try to persuade people to behave in ways that they want. And we usually associate this with advertising and commercial companies trying to get us to buy products. But they're also used by social marketers in trying to get us to change our behaviors, and in politics, again, to try to get policy changes, etc. But largely the definition has come into being and is fairly widely accepted in trying to change people's behaviors. And it works primarily by using media relations and other forms of third-party endorsement. So we see press releases and advertising campaigns, marketing campaigns built around communicating messages from an organization to a wider public. Lobbying, on the other hand, is a different element altogether. And lobbying is a legal way that organizations can influence government and legislators to support or oppose specific legislation and changes to legislations about how policy changes can be made. And lobbying mentions in the definition that it's a legal way, and you can see a graphic here that says on the one side it's what is illegal is special interest groups giving money directly to politicians. But in lobbying, there's an intermediary, which is the lobbyist or the lobbying organization, the company that's established and employs lobbyists to work on behalf of clients. And the money flows from the interested parties to the lobbyists to the politicians. And the money flows in particular ways. In some cases, it can be campaign funds. In other cases, it can be information trips to travel to places to see how things are happening. And this is a legal way of doing it in most Western countries. And lobbyists are intermediaries between clients and lawmakers, explaining their clients' interests in ways that make sense to the lawmakers, the legislators, the politicians, and talking about the potential obstacles that stand in the way of these changes happening. Excuse me. Canada's Federal Lobbying Act regulates the lobbying industry in Canada, and it's quite interesting the kind of things that they keep a register of. So lobbyists have to register with the Commissioner of Lobbying, and every time that they have an interaction with a politician or a politician's office, they have to create a record of that. So there's a written account of how the meeting occurred, what the medium of the meeting was, whether it was a phone conversation, a face-to-face conversation, and what the subject area was that they were talking about. You don't have to report on the actual detail of the conversation. And then the lobbying is subject to public scrutiny because the office, the commissioner, makes public all of the reports of these interactions, and it's to try to overcome any potential of conflict of interest. But this is how lobbying works to create a legal framework, a legal system that privileges and benefits corporate interests over citizens' interests, if you will. This is a picture of the website of the Office of the Commissioner. It's kind of an interesting place to spend a lot of time digging down and looking at all of the information that it contains. And you can see on this slide at the bottom that there's a big increase in the number of reports being issued, the big increase in the number of contacts that are being made between lobbyists and politicians. And when you drill down into the website, you can see which office the lobbyists are talking to and the general area of their conversation. But there's an interesting graphic here. You see in September 2024, the percentage increase in the number of lobbying interactions that took place around the environment, around economic development, around taxation and finance, around industry on a wide-based basis, and also around health. And potentially you can discern that the reason for these increases is largely because there was an American presidential election happening. And so companies are concerned that based on the outcome of the American election, whether it goes Republican or Democrat, it'll have an impact on the relationships between the US and Canada. And so lobbyists are trying to brief politicians on ways that the politicians can engage with their counterparts in the US to maintain even trading status or whatever. So there's always a flurry of activity around elections. One of the things that's not very evident from the Commissioner's report is how much money is spent on lobbying. And that's one of the statistics it's really difficult to find out in Canada. But we'll come back to that in a little while. So advocacy as the third stream of public relations. And advocacy is a dialogue or an intervention that is created by a not-for-profit organization or a non-governmental organization, usually organizations that don't have the resources that large corporate clients have. And it can be done by individuals as well and groups of individuals. And what they're looking to do there is to change policies, laws, or rules that impact society by targeting federal, provincial, and municipal agencies. Similar to the way that lobbyists are doing it, but they're doing it in an unpaid way. They're doing it without big resources behind them. So they're appealing through the notion of dialogue. They're appealing to people's ethical basis to try to change policies by highlighting inequalities and injustices. So one of the ways of doing that, the graphic here, is by people making protests. And I've got an example later that we'll look at about how one can make protest to try to influence policies and the actions of organizations and to hold them accountable to some extent. So the way that these elements work, to expand a little bit on what I've already talked about. So public relations, excuse me, using this model by Grunig and Hunt from 1984, you have this notion of a press agent. And if you remember in session 2, we looked at the work of Edward Bernays, and he was one of the original press agents in terms of crafting information that was being sent out into through the mass media into a public domain to explain the actions of an organization. And this is a one-way communication. Secondly, we can look at public information model, which is largely what government does. The type of communication it is one way again. It's coming from the government, from an organization, into the public sphere. And we see elements of things like press releases, press conferences, etc. to communicate. It's a one-way dialogue. Well, there's one-way communication. There's no real dialogue there. The third model that Grunig and Hunt identified is a two-way asymmetrical model. So you have two people in a dialogue, but one of them is much more powerful than the other. So this would be like me trying to have a conversation with the government. So I'm one person, I've got the resources of one person, the government has its thousands of civil servants and the resources it has behind it. So it's a very unequal dialogue between myself and the organization. So that would be an example of two-way asymmetrical dialogue. And the final one is a two-way symmetrical model where you have two parties who treat each other equally. They listen to each other. They have similar levels of resources. And these are the kind of things one sees in negotiations between unions and employers where the dialogue is fairly evenly balanced and people are respectful of each other's dialogue. So this is the core of public relations. And the tools of public relations, as I've said, are things like press releases, and media presentations. In lobbying, you have the history of lobbying here as a graphic you can look at. So lobbying has existed for a long time. It's existed in the courts of the kings and emperors in European societies, where people used to literally hang around court to put forward a petition to try to get something changed by the monarch or the emperor to suit their clients or their own personal needs. And you had lawyers that were working in this process because they would be able to read, for one thing, and they'd be able to craft new legislation that could be presented as an alternative, and then it would be up to the king or the emperor's the people working around them to read this and see if it was a reasonable thing to do. So now it's become much more commonplace, and it's become much more corporatized, if you will. And one of the things that's really, really interesting to look at lobbying, and this is an example from the United States, but you see it happening in Europe as well, and it's called the revolving door of lobbying. So what happens is elected politicians become unelected after a period in office, or they choose to resign from that office, and then they go on to work in lobbying companies. And one, they get a significant increase in the money they're earning personally. But because of the years that they spent in public service, they have access to all of their peers in public service still, the people who actually are the decision makers. So they go to work for a lobbying company, and they automatically have access back into the corridors of power, if you will. And on the other side of the graph, you can see that 42% of US representatives and 50% of US senators become lobbyists after leaving Congress, which is quite a staggering figure, if you will. And then what happens is, after a period of time in working for the lobbying industry, they'll maybe get a feeling to want to go back and get access to power themselves, so they'll stand for re-election in the next round of elections or the one afterwards, and they'll go back to being a lawmaker, a legislator. And so this process goes on and on. So it's known as the revolving door. You can see examples of it in many societies. And one of the issues with this, from an ethical perspective, is it's giving unequal access to legislators by corporations who can afford to pay the high fees that lobbying companies charge. So in advocacy tends to be the work that's done by individuals, by not-for-profit organizations, by non-governmental organizations. And there's a model that was published in 2023 looking at constituent-driven public policy advocacy. And I put the graphic here that you can look at in the reference if you want that to look at that yourself. But the key areas that worked in, it worked in pressure and accountability. So people can put pressure on their local constituents, their local member of parliament, their local councillor, and they can put pressure on them to get things changed if there's an injustice, but they can also use their voice to try to hold people accountable, hold process accountable. You can also do it by community engagement, by building a community around an idea, around an ethical issue, around an injustice that can try to put pressure to bear on the local representatives, if you will. You can also build coalitions between different interest groups working within a community, and the bigger the coalition, the stronger coalition you build, the greater you can put pressure on institutions of power and ask for accountability. It strengthens the capacity of the community through this notion of this advocacy work. And finally, you're building commitment by a community into the community itself, and then you're trying to get that commitment back into the community through one's elected representatives. So this is kind of examples of how these different elements of public relations are created. And then their intended purpose, what each of these processes do. So public relations is largely now it's turned into reputation management. So we see public relations in its traditional form being used in terms of organizations who are trying to protect themselves. As you saw maybe recently with Boeing, the issues that Boeing have had over the introductions of planes that are potentially not as safe as they could be. So they employed a lot of public relations activity to try to maintain their reputation, because they were concerned about the people who have bought their planes not wanting to fulfill the orders. They're worried about people who were flying the planes not wanting to fly them. And ultimately, they're worried about the value of their stock and the share price, because that has an impact on how much money they make themselves. So they implemented programs of reputation management to try to dissuade any people who are in the public sphere who had concerns around the safety of Boeing to say, no, these incidents are isolated incidents. Everything we do at Boeing is safe and secure. It conforms to regulations, etc. So this was how reputation management was one of the prime things that public relations does nowadays. You also see it in terms of individuals or politicians when they're trying to get elected and they've got something that happened in their past that they're not too keen, becomes public knowledge, and it becomes public knowledge. So they employ a public relations company to try to fix the issue and make it go away, or to reframe it in a more positive way. So reputation management is one of the things that public relations firms work nowadays. It tends to be a one-way dialogue with their constituents. So people who are interested or engaged or involved in a particular process. So use the Boeing example. The stakeholders that Boeing was trying to have a conversation with were institutional shareholders. It was the airlines who were buying the planes. It's the pilots who are flying the planes. And it's the passengers who are going to hopefully take seats on those planes and entrust their lives to the airlines that are flying these planes. But it was a one-way dialogue, because Boeing would not engage in a dialogue with me if I had a particular concern about the safety of a 777 I was going to fly from Toronto to Frankfurt, for example. There was no possibility of having that dialogue. So it's a one-way asymmetrical process. And it's an aspect of the larger consumer marketing. It's used by corporations to give information to potential customers, to try to have some kind of relationship with them, to try to influence their behavior a little bit, but it's a non-dialogic form of communication. Advocacy, I talked to you before previously, it's built around not-for-profits and non-governmental organizations. It's trying to bring justice and support for marginalized issues and peoples in the community largely, and it's run by not-for-profits and non-governmental organizations. Lobbying, it's got three fundamental aims. One is the pursuit of a corporate agenda. The second is growth for the company in terms of either its market share or its share price. It's looking for growth because growth increases the financial value of the organization. And as corporations, that they are legally responsible for increasing shareholder value, shareholder returns. So when companies are lobbying, this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to protect their interests and create favorable conditions to grow. So some examples. This is a press release. You won't be able to read it unless your German's good, but it's just an example of how a corporation puts a document out into the public sphere dealing with a specific issue and providing information that corporation wants the public to know and understand. In terms of advocacy, this is a kind of simple example, but it's a Facebook page for the Chelsea Rails to Trails. And for some of you might know that there was a railway that ran between Hull and Wakefield. And then over years, through disrepair, it became untenable to use as a railway. So a local group came together to put pressure on the owners of the railroad, the owners of the land, to take up the train tracks and make it into a multi-purpose trail. So eventually that happened through a lot of lobbying and also advocacy work. And now through advocacy, there's a Facebook page for people who use the trail to recommend things and to point out things that are happening on the trail that shouldn't happen, or that are working against the interests of the trail and trail users. So for example, it's something I posted. I was out on a walk the other day, and they're doing some work to improve the crossing over the 105 to make it safer. But one of the things, this is on Friday afternoon, so after the contractors have disappeared for the weekend, they're not going to be back till Monday morning. I took some photographs, and they very kindly leave all of their garbage behind, their Tim Hortons cups, their whatever, their McDonald's sandwich bags, whatever. They just leave it behind. So by taking a photograph or series of photographs and posting these on the Facebook page, I'm raising awareness to the people who are connected to the councillors, to people who work for the municipality, that this is a potential issue. And it's a way of, and I know that the people who maintain the page are very closely connected to the municipality, so this information will go back to the municipality. So to save me going and being a Mr. Angry person and banging on the doors of the municipality, I can post some photographs here, so I'm an advocate for proper practice on the construction site, on the trail. So it's a simple form of advocacy. It's not about human rights or injustices particularly, but I think it's a reasonable example of what advocacy can mean at a local level. And in lobbying, just as I say, we've explained how lobbying works, but just to give you some example, this is a graphic that I took at the weekend from the Office of the Commissioner for Lobbying, and this is the number of reports that are filed. So you can see here the massive increase from the bottom left to the top right of the graphic, the massive increase in lobbying that's taking place in Canada over the last several years, which is quite phenomenal. But it also shows the efficacy of lobbying, but also points towards the amount of money that's involved in that. So if you're a not-for-profit fighting against a corporation, and this is where, excuse me, the notion of doubt and climate change comes into relevance in this conversation, because a lot of the entities who are trying to raise awareness about climate change and what we as individuals in society can do around climate change were not-for-profit organizations, were NGOs, were individuals, were concerned individuals, were loose alliances of people, but were fighting against corporate interests. So you have advocacy on one hand, fighting against lobbying and corporate interests on the other hand, and it's a very unequal argument. So this is the number of reports that are filed. This is just the number of lobbyists and lobbying organizations. As I say, you can spend hours on this website looking at data if you're a data nerd like I tend to be. So I'm not going to, it's just a very graphic illustration to show you the extent that lobbying is at play in Canada. One of the interesting things is you can't find out very easily how much money is spent on lobbying in Canada. And it's kind of interesting that the Office of the Commissioner for Lobbying in Canada doesn't publish any data on the amount of money that's spent. So you go to the United States, where there is some tracking of the amount of money that's spent. So this is a graphic that's produced looking at, and I know you can't see the detail too much, I've pulled out some of the top issues. So in 2023, pharmaceutical companies spent nearly $400 million on lobbying in Washington. This is lobbying Senate, Congress. Electronics companies, this is Apple's and the Intel's and the chip manufacturers, they spent $238 million lobbying. Insurance companies spent $157 million lobbying. And what's interesting is to track these things over different years to see where interests from corporate interests lie. And one of the reasons insurance companies are spending so much money now in terms of lobbying government is because they want laws to change to make sure that they don't have to make payouts in situations that are created by extreme weather events. Because obviously, the more extreme weather events we have, the greater the level of insurance claims we have. And if insurance companies can change acts of God or whatever the language is in legal contracts, if they can change it to something that excludes having to pay out in freak weather occurrences or whatever, then they save a lot of money and they make more profit for themselves. So one could maybe look at this over a period of time and say the amount of lobbying done by insurance companies is increasing greatly. And I'm making that as a correlation there, not a causal event. In terms of air transportation, 136 million, and I guess a large part of this will be Boeing trying to change legislation around the safety records of corporations, et cetera, that are operating in air transport. And then finally, oil and gas. And what's surprising here is how little oil and gas companies are spending on trying to lobby for their interests in Washington. And I think that points to the fact that there's an awful lot of lobbying that happens in the United States that isn't recorded because they don't have an office of lobbying in the same way that Canada does. And the reason I'm putting US figures here is because there's nothing available in Canada, but you can reckon that there is some serious money being spent in Canada lobbying for oil and gas corporations, for shale extraction, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you for joining me for this short session. I look forward to our next time together in session 5, where we'll be looking at other aspects of how media and public relations helps contribute to the creation of doubt about the science around climate change.